Hello and welcome to the program. Prime Minister Tony Abbott and the Chinese Premier have both expressed their determination to conclude free trade talks before the end of the year. Mr Abbott's on the Chinese island of Hainan, attending the Boao Economic Forum. He held the talks with the Chinese Premier last night. Now, the free trade agreement isn't on the formal agenda, but the two men, it's understood, while the talks were behind closed doors, did discuss this issue and, as I say, expressed their determination to conclude a free trade agreement by the end of the year. On this matter and a few others, I spoke to the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Secretary, Josh Frydenberg, from Shanghai last night.
Well, Kieran, the Prime Minister's had a very successful trip both to Japan and Korea. As you say, not just strengthening security ties, but also concluding FTA discussions with Japan and signing the agreement with Korea. Next stop is China, and I'm very confident he'll receive a very warm welcome there. And the Chinese do understand that we have a very strong friendship with Japan, just like Japan understands that we have a deep friendship with China and that China is our #1 trading partner. So I think both countries understand our position, and having strong relationships with the three countries in North Asia, namely Japan, China and Korea, are certainly not mutually exclusive.
But do you concede there have been tensions with China after our Foreign Minister issued a rebuke of China for establishing that air identification zone in the East China Sea? They weren't happy about it. Are you hopeful that they will be as pragmatic on that issue as the Japanese have been over whaling, with an FTA struck this week regardless?
Look, I understand that the Chinese are very pragmatic, and so too is Australia. And while there may be some disagreements on issues from time to time, we also have disagreements with our other major partners, namely the United States. So I'm very confident that China and Australia will work through any differences that they have, can move forward to negotiating a free trade agreement in due course, but also to deepen strategic and political bonds. And we now have some of the infrastructure in place to do that. So I'm very confident, Kieran, that we don't have to choose between our friends in the region. We can get on well with all of them. And I must say that often the political left in Australia say that Australia has to distance itself from the United States in order to deepen its relations with China. I simply do not accept that. If you go back to October 2003, in 1 week, both the President of China, Hu Jintao, and the President of the United States, President George W. Bush, addressed the Australian Parliament. And that was a very clear message to not only Australians, but also to other countries around the world, that we can manage our relationships with the United States and with China constructively and productively.
We've had the Japanese and the South Korean free trade agreements finalised. The two leaders have said they're determined to have this one done by the end of the year. What are the last stumbling blocks? Is it all about foreign investment rules?
Well, the sensitive areas will be on agriculture for us, because obviously we want greater access into the Chinese market. I mean, currently tariffs on wine are in some cases up to 30%. Now, Australia currently exports more than $200 million of wine on an annual basis into China. Imagine what we could do, Kieran, if we could reduce that tariff. So too with dairy. Currently tariffs are up to 20%, but we export $350 million worth of dairy products into China. We want to sell more dairy into China, and we can do that by lowering the tariffs. We really do need a deal with China. We need it for two reasons. Firstly, China is a growing market, 1.3 billion people, and they're moving a remarkable 20 million people every year from the regions into the city. This growing middle class are changing their dietary habits, and we need to be able to capitalise on their needs. The second reason why we need to get a free trade agreement with China is because our other competitive countries around the world are also getting one. So China has an agreement already with the ASEAN countries, as an FTA with Chile and as an FTA with New Zealand. And ever since New Zealand entered into an FTA with China in 2008, they've seen a more than doubling in their exports into China, and a remarkable six-fold increase in their dairy exports into China. So we want to replicate that sort of growth in two-way trade, and we can do that through an FTA. In terms of the other sensitive issues to be discussed, obviously around investment into Australia, currently there's a cap of $248 million on approvals for investment into Australia without getting the FIRB tick-off. Certainly China will want to look at that more closely, as well as removing some of the tariffs on footwear and textiles into Australia, which can be in some cases 5% up to 10%. So that will be another area. But for us, getting agriculture access will be important, as well as services, Kieran. Currently there are restrictions on universities operating here in China. There are equity restrictions on Australian banks who want to invest in equivalent banks here in China. So we think there's great scope for banks, for law firms and for our universities to operate more freely in China, and that will certainly be part of the discussions for a free trade agreement between the two countries.
What do you say, Josh Frydenberg, to the assessment of many commentators that say that China's rise economically has also been accompanied by a growing assertiveness on foreign policy? Many would say an aggressiveness in terms of its foreign policy.
Well, firstly, you asked me about China's economic strength, and I certainly welcome that. A remarkable, 300 million plus people have been moved out of poverty into the middle class in China as a result of their economic growth. And Australia, Kieran, has been a great beneficiary of China's economic growth as they require our resources, our agriculture, our services in greater numbers. So that's extremely welcome. And I should also point out that historically, China has been one of the largest economies in the world. In fact, Henry Kissinger wrote this great book called On China, where he said, of the last 20 centuries, China was the largest economy in the world in a remarkable 18 of those 20 centuries. It was only when the Industrial Revolution took hold that China fell behind some other Western countries. So that is an extremely important contextual point to understand about China's economic growth. In terms of their assertiveness, well, we would encourage all countries, whether it's China, Japan, Korea, or any other country in Southeast Asia, to ensure that there's stability and that there's peace and that the rule of law takes hold. And that's our common position. We don't encourage tensions by any means, but we would expect all parties to ensure that there is stability and peace in our region.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, thanks so much for your time from Shanghai. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Kieran.